When I first enlisted in the military, I was incredibly naive. I believed a lot of what the recruiters told me, without really understanding the difference between doctrine, the ideal way things should work, and reality, the way they actually were. I thought officers were these top-tier, college-educated individuals who came off as distant but were still wholly dedicated to the mission. I also thought non-commissioned officers were the most skilled, dependable soldiers, promoted simply because they were the best at what they did. And I assumed that my fellow soldiers and I would find a sense of family among each other, united by our commitment to defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. It didn't take long into my first year to realize that, with only a few exceptions, none of these ideas were true. I'd married my high school sweetheart, Sarah, who was a couple years younger than me. I was eager to prove myself both as a soldier and as a man. I volunteered for overseas assignments, combat duty, and any tough job that came my way. Growing up in a poor neighborhood, the military seemed like the best way to escape that life and move up to something better. The pitch I was sold was simple: if I took care of defending the country, the army would take care of me and my family. Well, that didn't quite pan out for me or my 19-year-old bride. By the way, all names have been changed. My initial military training covered boot camp, airborne qualification, and ranger school. I checked off a lot of boxes and was considered a bona fide badass according to the Army standards. But instead of getting assigned to a Special Operations Unit, or the 82nd Airborne, I found myself stationed overseas on a security detail that had nothing to do with being an elite soldier. It was just a matter of luck. To keep it brief, the security job had me working 24-hour shifts followed by 24 hours off, and then 8 hours of regular work for 3 days. But due to downsizing and the endless overseas conflicts, the Army reduced our manpower from 5 shifts to just 2. So instead of the promised work schedule, my team and I ended up working a brutal 24-hour duty shift, followed by 6 hours of admin work, then 18 hours off, every single day of the year. Instead of putting in the expected 2,000 hours a year, we were logging closer to 5,000. This crazy schedule ended up taking a toll on my job and my marriage during my first military assignment. Sarah, who had a high school diploma, but no specialized training, spent a lot of her time at the on-base rec center while I was on shift, surrounded by hundreds of other young soldiers. Erin, 19, female, was a striking blonde with blue eyes, a figure that could have been straight out of a magazine, and a smile that could light up a room. She was the quintessential high school cheerleader, but sharp as a tack. Our plan was for her to work on college courses while I brought home the paycheck. My shifts were brutal, and within just a few months, I was physically and mentally drained from the endless 24-hour schedules. When I finally got home, all I wanted was a hot meal and some sleep. As newlyweds, we did have sex, usually about 3 times a week, but I was so wiped out that I'd often fall asleep right afterward. So, Erin's attention started to wander. She was taking college courses, and while we were overseas, it wasn't uncommon for officers to make extra cash by teaching night classes as adjunct professors. One of those officers was a guy I'll call Captain Dustin. Erin would constantly talk about how smart he was and how much she loved his classes. After hearing about how great he was, I decided to pop into one of her classes and peek through the window. I saw her facial expression, and it looked like she had a little crush on him. When we finally met him, I had to address him as Captain Dustin, but Erin just called him by his first name, Dustin. That made me feel uneasy right away, especially since their relationship was supposed to be teacher-student, and I had concerns about what was going on after class. But those 24-hour shifts kept going, with no end in sight. Toward the end of my assignment, Erin asked for a legal separation. I had a feeling it had something to do with Captain Dustin, but with no time or money to investigate, thanks to those 24-hour shifts, I just signed the separation papers, sending her back to the States 6 months before my tour ended. Later, I found out that her request for separation lined up perfectly with Captain Dustin's rotation back to the States. 6 months later, I rotated out of that duty, and to my surprise, Erin seemed ready to give our marriage another shot. I loved her deeply, and growing up with a divorced mom, I was determined to avoid that fate. I wanted to stay married no matter what. So, I took her back. Part of the reason she came back was that my mother-in-law had shamed her into it. We moved to a new duty station and had 8-hour shifts this time. I'd earned a few promotions, and now we had some extra cash, so we could enjoy eating out and going on date nights. One day, I came home early and heard the phone ring as I walked through the door. This was before everyone had cell phones, so we had one in the kitchen and another in the bedroom upstairs. Erin picked up the phone, and I overheard her say, "Hello, Keith." I was on the kitchen extension, so I quickly covered the receiver so she wouldn't know I was listening. I'd always suspected she was seeing Captain Dustin, but now, I was hearing it all firsthand, the affair, every detail, starting with, "Can we talk? I miss you." And then some really graphic stuff about their year-long affair. Dustin had followed us to the news station. I didn't have a recorder, so maybe the evidence would have helped, but when the conversation ended with, "I love you," and she hung up, I was crushed. Without wasting any time, I confronted her right then and there. "How long?" After a lot of tears, she finally admitted to sleeping with him while she was his student. She claimed their affair had restarted after I came back to the States. I asked, "Why him?" She gave me a bunch of reasons. I was just a soldier with barely enough money to get by, while Dustin was a captain with flight pay, making way more than me. She said he could take her out to fancy restaurants, buy her gifts, and spoil her, while I could barely cover our rent and bills. She was tired of being broke. As a typical guy, I wondered if he was better in bed or maybe had something I didn't. She told me that his size didn't compare to mine, his muscles weren't anything special, and he was good in bed but not amazing. "Why?" I asked. She replied, "He makes me feel like a princess, but you're still just a poor soldier." I immediately started plotting how I could get back at him. But I knew it had to be done without raising any suspicions. After all, if a junior soldier attacked a senior officer, it would lead to a court-martial, possibly jail time, or worse. But I couldn't just stand by and let this 28-year-old creep keep sleeping with my 21-year-old wife. Erin kept insisting it was just a mistake. I asked her, "It might have been a mistake when we were overseas because of my awful schedule, but it wasn't a mistake when we came back to the States. He chased after you after we ended our separation, and you spread your legs for him." She came back with, "But I came back to you." And I shot back, "But you're still sleeping with him." That's when our intimacy ended. I didn't want to be with her knowing she'd been with him. My disgust and lack of interest in her only pushed her further back into his arms. After a few weeks of tension, anger, and silence, Erin finally said, "We need to talk." I agreed. She claimed she had never denied me food, sex, or love while she was still seeing him. She said our marriage was her priority, and he was just sex, just fun, and a way for her to feel special when I wasn't around. I agreed that my military duties had made me unavailable while we were overseas. The 24-hour shifts were grueling. But when I came back to the States and started doing 8-hour shifts, I was there. How was I still unavailable? I took her back because I was still crazy about the girl I married. She still looked like the hot, toned, spicy woman I'd fallen in love with. But I was losing it when I found out she was still seeing him, even though I was home every night. Except for short training exercises that lasted about a week every couple of months, I was home. I later found out they were meeting during lunch breaks and were holed up together at a motel 24/7 whenever I was away for training. I'll admit, her body could drive any man wild. I told her I was going to take care of him if she didn't stop seeing him. Within a week, I got orders for a 1-year unaccompanied tour overseas. I was heading into a combat zone, and for the rest of the time, she fucked me every night and morning until I left. In short, I didn't have the chance to get my revenge. While I was overseas, my wife of 2 years wrote to me, and I would write back. Back then, emails weren't common, especially in a combat zone. So, her letters took about a week to reach me, and my replies took another week to get to her. Over the course of the year, we exchanged 24 letters. As soldiers rotated in and out of my unit, I heard whispers about my wife hanging out at the officers' and NCO clubs. No one had concrete proof, but the rumors that she was acting like some barfly made me lose my mind. I heard she had been with Captain Keith D., Captain Jeff C., Captain Tom R., and eventually a guy named Rick C. The gossip had turned her from a sweet young bride into a complete slut. I started planning my revenge. I couldn't wait for my midterm leave, 6 months in, 2 weeks home, then another 6 months. But when I went to buy my flight ticket, I found out that the money I'd saved up in my account had already been withdrawn a month earlier. I thought I could use my credit card, only to discover it was maxed out. I had 2 weeks off, but no way to get home. I managed to get to a phone and tried calling home every 2 hours on the first day of my leave. No answer. I tried again the next day, still no answer. So, I wrote an angry letter asking where my ticket money went and what was going on with Keith, Jeff, Steve, and Tom. My savings and checking accounts were drained, and my credit card was maxed out, so I had no choice but to cancel my leave and return to my unit. I spent another 6 months on the front lines, volunteering for every dangerous mission that came up. I earned the respect of my fellow soldiers and even got a promotion that year. When I finally flew back home, I came with a few new medals, a sense of accomplishment, and a strong desire for an immediate divorce. I hadn't heard from my wife in months, so I knew it was over. When I got back to the U.S., I found out she was pregnant. I'd been gone for a year, and she was 4 months along. She didn't know who the father was. After all, she'd been sleeping with multiple men. She told me, "We can fix this." But I wasn't interested in fixing anything with a woman who had betrayed me so deeply. Some things can't be fixed. Not only was she pregnant, but she also had an STD and pelvic inflammatory disease, PID. I filed for divorce immediately. Unfortunately, our state didn't recognize adultery as grounds for divorce. It was a no-fault state. We had a hearing, and while I didn't have to pay alimony, I was stuck with child support, even though the child wasn't mine. In this state, if you're married to the mother, you're responsible for the child, regardless of biological ties. Despite everything, I was finally divorced and felt free for the first time in 4 years. She had finished college during our marriage, and unfortunately, I'd co-signed her student loan, so I was stuck with that debt. I also had the car payment to deal with, along with the child support. I volunteered to go back to the combat zone, mainly for the danger pay and the free meals. 16 years later, her daughter wrote me a letter, and I was shocked. I was still in the army, but this was the first time I had heard from the child I'd financially supported all these years. In her letter, she said she wanted to change her last name and be adopted by her mom's new husband. I didn't have any biological connection to her, so I wrote back and said, "Granted." The adoption meant that my child support payments ended, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally move on. Her mom had married one of her affair partners, Rick, and the child, who wasn't mine biologically, took his last name, was legally adopted, and a few years later, had Rick walk her down the aisle at her wedding. I wasn't invited. So why am I sharing this? I just needed to get it off my chest. After 4 years of emotional hell and nearly 2 decades of being financially tied to that mess, I was finally a free man. I've often thought about seeking revenge on her various lovers, but after the divorce, I focused on becoming the best version of myself. I earned a bachelor's degree, then a master's, and eventually found a loyal wife, so my story has a happy ending. But it took almost 20 years to get there. Why didn't I take revenge? Honestly, no woman is worth going to jail over, and nothing short of extreme violence would have been enough to satisfy my need for vengeance. I walked away from a disloyal liar and thief and into a successful military career, despite the fact that many of my superiors were just as ethically compromised as my ex-wife. In the end, my journey has shown me that loyalty and integrity are priceless. It took nearly 2 decades, but I eventually found my peace and my happy ending.